Good afternoon, everyone. We wanted to give everybody a little bit of time to join this afternoon. On behalf of the CFA Society of South Florida, we're very happy you took time out of your day to join us for such an important topic. My name is Cameron Fatui. I serve on the board of directors for our chapter, heading up advocacy initiatives. My full-time job is assisting clients with regulatory initiatives and litigation support services for capital forensics. I'm extremely pleased to introduce Doran Goldstein, who I had the privilege to work with on projects in the past. Doran is a privacy and cybersecurity partner at Withers Worldwide, based in New York. Doran assists clients to address and overcome complex situations involving privacy, data security, and information technology. His clients are across many industries, but he does have a concentration with financial service firms. Doran is a former software developer and network administrator. He was named a cybersecurity trailblazer by the National Law Journal. He was one of the first lawyers to be certified as a privacy law specialist by the International Association of Privacy Professionals and accredited by the American Bar Association, and is also a certified information privacy professional. His IT background allows him to thoroughly understand his clients' operations and evaluate the risks they face. With that, I will soon turn it over to Doran, but I just want to say from my background, interacting with many regulators and being a former regulator, cybersecurity is such a big threat to our industry. And I remember we did a joint session with many regulators, Federal Reserve, the SEC, and the FBI. And the FBI panelist started his presentation by saying, after terrorism, we believe cybersecurity is the biggest threat that we faced. And with that, I'll turn it over to Doran to share his insights with us.
Hi, so sorry about the quick disappearance there, as tends to happen during COVID times. It was exactly now that my neighbor decided to mow his lawn, so I had to run outside and ask him to stop for it. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining. By way of quick introduction to what we're going to be discussing, I want to give a little bit of background to sort of what we're seeing now in terms of threats, in terms of the cost, in terms of the liability for in cybersecurity space, what some of the particular threat vectors are that we're seeing, and this is from a combination of sort of my experience and what others are seeing. We're going to talk about two specific attacks, ransomware and business email compromise, which are two things that are very common, and talk through some examples that we've seen in that area. Talk through some of the things in terms of best practices that we can implement to try to reduce our risk or mitigate damage when it happens. And then being a lawyer, I do have to talk a little bit about our legal environment and talk really about some of the enforcement actions and some of what we'll see, what we are seeing and are likely to see in the future in the financial services space. And then hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. The slides actually, even though there aren't a lot of them, do have a lot of material in them. I'm not going to cover all of the material and really do welcome questions. So if there's something I've skipped over that seems interesting or something that you do want to ask, please do throw that in the Q&A through Zoom. And Cameron and I will try to address those points as we go through the presentation. So let me talk a little bit about what the world is like in terms of cybersecurity and data breaches. And we think a lot about China as an actor, or other state actors who are trying to get involved. The reality is organized crime, and that term is, we tend to think of organized crime as the Italian mafia or that type of organization. Really, right now, cyber criminals are actually organized. And a lot of this now, it's really a business model for them. So about 80% of data breaches now are caused by organized crime. And the top motive, I think, as would make sense, is really financial. One of the biggest causes of concern for companies, and I think rightly so, is ransomware, which is now about 10% of the totality of all breaches, intentional, unintentional, insiders. Ransomware is that threat, and it's probably the most damaging of those, as we'll talk about a little bit later. In our particular industry that we're talking about now, what's interesting is that insiders actually are a much larger threat than a lot of other industries. It's about 44% is internal actors. Again, very often, and these are generally lower level breaches, you send emails to the wrong person. And that is a breach. The wrong person has received personal data. And that's where a lot of it comes from. In terms of sort of the bad actor version of it, again, this is specifically in the financial space. Financial motive is really, is almost everything, with state actors being a tiny percent, being about 3% of what was seen. And this is based on 2021 data from Verizon, from IBM. And again, most of the data that's compromised is really personal information. One of the things that is of concern, and this is something I talk about whenever I give these presentations, is the amount of time bad actors are in your system. And this is really something that's important to think about internally and think about when you react, but also it's important to understand when you see somebody who takes a very long time and you see their notices, it says, this is something that happened 6 months ago, we're only telling you now. Well, the reality is it takes, on average, over 9 months to identify a breach and contain it. It's about 212 days on average to find it, to see that something happened. And then about 60 days after that, depending on the industry, to actually manage to contain the incident. So these things really do take time, and it's important to think about that as part of your planning. So now we come to the cost. And I think this is a piece that gets minimized a lot. And one of the things that we will be talking about a lot in this presentation is there are a lot of things you can do at various stages, both in planning for an incident, planning your security, and then responding to the incident that can help mitigate the costs and reduce the costs. But the average cost of a data breach in 2021 actually rose from the 2020 number by about 10%. So it's about 4.25 million is the average cost of a data breach that was investigated or that was included within the IBM report. And very often, the two pieces that we're talking about, business email compromise and ransomware, are actually the two most expensive types of claims. But what's interesting is that business email compromises actually are more expensive in terms of total cost than ransomware. The other statistics I wanted to include here are some of the things that can change the cost for you. So a company that has, and this is one of the things that, that Cameron and I talk about, is that having an incident response plan and testing that plan can reduce the cost when an incident happens, can actually reduce your total cost by about 50%. So really thinking about it now and planning for it now makes a significant difference to you in how you're able to address those. Likewise, unfortunately, you can't control the fact that you're a regulated industry. You are. The more compliant you are, so in other words, the more you have gone through and checked the regulations to make sure you've sort of checked as many of those boxes as you can, the more likely you are to be able to mitigate your fines. And that kind of goes without saying, but I think that seeing the numbers in front of you, that there's about a 50% difference in cost by doing that, makes a significant difference. And one of the challenges that we're now facing in a world that is progressively more remote is that remote work increases, or an incident arising from some element of remote work actually increases the cost by about a quarter. So we're in a world now where some of that risk is really unavoidable. So we now have to think about what can we do to reduce some of those risks. So what are our threat vectors right now? How are the bad guys attacking us? The most obvious one is what we call public-facing vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. that's when there is something wrong with the system. Sometimes it's a 0-day, which means nobody knew that there was a hole in Microsoft or AWS or whatever the service is. Nobody knew it was there, but once it's there, the bad guys start taking advantage of that. So that's what a 0-day is. It's a previously unknown exploit. But there are also a lot of things that people do with their systems where they don't even think of closing down a particular issue. I'll give you one example that happened to a client of mine a number of years ago, which is that this client had used a relatively common e-commerce platform for its website. There was a problem, there was a vulnerability in that software. It was a known vulnerability, so the company actually said, we have this problem. Here is a patch for that. The problem is the initial patch didn't work. It actually took down the servers of my client, so they weren't able to implement that patch. A few weeks later, there was a new patch that came out that worked and that fixed the vulnerability. Unfortunately, during the time of that gap, in other words, between the time the vulnerability was known and the time the client patched the vulnerability, a bad actor got in and literally captured every transaction that went through the system. So captured hundreds of thousands of credit cards because there was a hole there. And that, again, is a very common vulnerability. The bad guys do look for these known vulnerabilities. Another thing that happens, unfortunately, regularly is companies, rather than engaging an outside forensic vendor to go through their system and make sure that once they've there's an existing infection and actually make sure it's completely removed, they sort of leave traces of it, which are just enough to get to allow bad guys to get in. And again, sometimes misconfigurations will continue to perpetuate an existing malware infection. And that, again, leaves the bad guys with just that little bit of toehold to get in. Our vendors, we all use vendors, even from the largest company to the smallest, vendors really hold a lot of our information, and their vulnerabilities are our vulnerabilities. Ultimately, we're responsible to our own clients, our own customers. So even if it's vendor X that had the breach, ultimately their vulnerability is ours. And very often when we look at our vendors, we don't do the due diligence that is necessary to make sure we sort of trust that they know what they're doing. And if they have a compromise, that actually compromises our systems as well. And as I discussed earlier, remote access is a significant issue. But one of the vectors that is particularly common and that I think is worth some discussion is spear phishing. And this is generally an email compromise, and it leads to some of the actual attacks that we see. And the way it's usually done is, using publicly available information, whether it's on social media or elsewhere. An individual gathers some information, identifies who they should attack, and sends an email that looks like it's legitimate. That for whatever reason, they either change one letter in a name or change one letter in the domain name, or otherwise do something that makes it look like it's real. And we're all in a rush and we all say, oh, that's from X. Makes sense. You open it up and it looks like a personalized email. And you go through it because you recognize it. And then you click on the link in the email. And I think, Cameron, you had some examples of spear phishing.
Yeah, I do. And this goes back to my time at FINRA. So I was in the Dallas office, responsible for the broker dealers in Texas, and I got a call really early in the morning. I think it was before 7:30 or so, and it was a broker dealer that was a online only platform based broker dealer, and so very little communication on the phone with representatives. And they called and said that we have identified a replicated website of us, and they gave me the domain. I went in there, exact same name. It was .net instead of .com. It was really well done, And um, and so this firm, how they identified it is was part of their program for cybersecurity and social tracking. They always Google the name of their firm every morning with other names as well, and that's how they caught it. So I gave them the name of the FBI in the Houston office, and they work with that department, and it was a foreign group out of the Soviet Union or Russia today, that was identified by the FBI. So it's really interesting, very well done. And to Doran's point, they dedicated a lot to this, and they're very, very good at this type of activity.
And I think to Cameron's point, I think one of the things that we, I think, have gotten lulled into a bit of sense of complacency is assuming that a lot of these attacks are sort of the Nigerian prince type of thing that we used to see, that are not in good English, that, you know, where there are a lot of tells as to it being an attempted fraud or attempted scam. The vast majority of what we are seeing now is much more sophisticated than that, where it's really on you to think through this and to really examine what you're getting. Because once you've clicked through on that website, once you have opened the PDF that's attached, or et cetera, the payload's been delivered, right? So either malware is introduced into your system, or in the case that Cameron was talking about, you've gone to this website that you think is the legitimate website, you've typed in your credentials, and now the bad guy has your credentials not for whatever the legitimate site was. And one of the challenges that I'll talk about is people very often reuse credentials. So not only do they have that password and that account compromised, they have other accounts where you've used the same credentials or similar credentials where they can do something called password stuffing, which is they use the same, they use those credentials and just go through multiple sites and see if they work. So there's no thought process on their part. This is all automated. And once they've gotten that information, once they get into the system, they actually go around, and they're very often very patient. They go through your system, see if they can find out other information that they can use in other attacks. So if they get into Cameron's account, they'll see that Cameron's attached to me, you know, that we have a connection, we have communication. They'll then say, oh, well, my next time I'll go after this Doran guy and I'll make it look like it came from Cameron. And then the whole cycle starts again. So it's really important that we all take actions to ourselves to try to prevent this particular vector, because again, it spins out quite quickly. And so what happens once one of these vectors, once they come in through one of these vectors, what are the types of things that can happen? So the first one is malware. Is a ransomware attack. And really what ransomware does is it locks down your system. Traditional ransomware has locked down, encrypted all the data on your system. And from that point, they offer you for a price, the key to decrypt your files, right? To have access back to them. One of the things that is more dangerous recently is that not only are they encrypting the data on your system, they're making a copy of it outside your system. So not only have you lost access to your data, you now also have a breach of the data that is now in somebody's hands. So even if you pay to get the data decrypted, so your system's decrypted, some of that data is out. So you have an additional breach issue that you have to worry about. And what happens, and I think this is an important piece of this, is very often these threat actors stay within your system for a very long time, looking for a time where they will cause the most damage, but also looking for a way that they can infect the most systems. Because the longer it's in your system, the more likely it is that all of your backup systems will have this, but also that you won't have logs that will show exactly when the system was infected. So you might not be able to track back a way of getting your data back. And one of the other things we've seen over the last number of years is that the bad actors are going through and saying, if you pay us today, it's 5 Bitcoin. Tomorrow it goes up to 7, the next day it goes up to 12. And so they progressively increase the cost of doing, of paying them to do this. Now, one of the important things to think about in ransomware is that law enforcement will generally recommend that you do not make payments. So working a lot with law enforcement, as I do, and doing them the favor of raising this, I will tell you that law enforcement's view generally is you don't pay these guys because it just encourages them to do it more. And the other thing I can tell you is that once a company pays, it is not uncommon for bad actors to come after you again, because they know that this is somebody who is willing to pay. So you actually might increase the likelihood of you becoming a target. Most of the ransomware actors will not themselves go after the same target twice. There are some exceptions to that, but most of them won't go after the same target twice. But once it becomes known that within the community that you paid, it is likely that you will be targeted again. So the other type of compromise that is increasingly common is what's called the business email compromise. And similar to spear phishing, the goal is identifying a particular target or targets to go after. And very often this is leadership of a company or somebody involved in a particular transaction. And what the bad guy does is go in, somehow through a compromised system, find a way to create a relationship or a purported relationship between him or herself and the target. So often that means taking over an email account of somebody else. So it's not your email account that's taken over, it's somebody you communicate with regularly. And they just monitor that account. So what they will do is essentially automatically forward all the emails to themselves, and then only periodically jump in to do things. So they try to create those relationships, and then suddenly at a particular point, usually, for example, just before a transaction closes, a fake Cameron will jump in and tell me, oh, Doran, sorry, I've changed my wire instructions. And again, it is coming from an email. It is actually coming from Cameron's email address. Doran, I just need to change the wire instructions, so please send it to this bank instead. And, thinking it's from Cameron, who I was just emailing with 5 minutes ago, I will respond, sure, I'll do that. That email, because the bad actor is already in his account, will never get to Cameron. And I will send the money to the wrong place. So it's really important with respect to financial transactions to make sure that you are dealing with the person that you are expecting to deal with, and that any instruction is confirmed. There are a lot of ways that these things are done. I think, Cameron, you had a couple of examples.
Yeah. Just from a implication standpoint, not only firms, your clients may be harmed, your employer, your business, from the perspective of your clients, but also there's other ramifications from the various regulatory bodies, the states, with the data that may have been exposed. So just recently, August 30th, 2021, the SEC brought 3 actions covering cybersecurity procedures. And this was covering a number of well-known broker-dealers. I won't name them, but it covers their failure to have cybersecurity policies and procedures that were adequate enough that failed to protect email account takeovers, which then exposed PII data for thousands of clients. So the SEC went after a number of firms, and this is pretty fresh in 2021. Also, FINRA has had many releases on this. From a standpoint of what actually happens to clients, investors, when I was at FINRA, we would routinely get calls, and also with my work at Capital Forensics, from situations where there's email takeovers of clients, and instructions are sent via email. The firms that actually had good policies in place would not honor those. They would call back the clients at the number they knew. They would have someone call that knows the person's voice, et cetera. But in a number of cases that I remember, large funds were wired. I remember there was one for 200,000, 150, 400,000, and it really hit the bottom line for these firms. So just to give you some examples of what Doran is discussing, and these real world threats that are occurring all around us.
Yeah, thanks. And I think one of the things, the threat actors are smart and they know at what level, for example, the FBI is likely to want to get involved. So very often what they'll do is they will do a series of one or two transactions to start with, and then maybe some later once, if the vulnerability isn't closed, as I'd mentioned earlier, sometimes you sort of think you've eradicated it and you haven't. Excuse me. They will try to keep those, the amounts relatively low, and by relatively low, it's usually under $1.5 million, because very often you will not get the FBI's interest at amounts less than that. So they kind of know where those lines are, and if it's a number of things over a period of time that are under $1.5 million each time, unless you can associate all of those, very often they feel that they can get away with it because federal law enforcement isn't as likely to get involved. And really what the bad guys try to do is they look for softer targets. And as targets get, as companies progressively lock down their systems more, what happens is the bad guys start looking at all of these other places where they can get into the systems. One of the big ones that I already mentioned is remote work. We all don't secure our systems, our own personal systems, nearly as well as corporate systems are. Portable devices also, we all sort of think our iPhones or Android phones are relatively safe from ransomware. They're not, or from malware. They are not, and they are sometimes taken over. There was recently, it turns out that there is a 0-day non-click exploit in iOS. And I'm not blanking on the name of the Israeli spyware firm that had been selling this to governments, but they basically took advantage of a system that, of a hole in iOS that let them get into all of these systems without anybody even clicking on anything. So all of these things are vulnerabilities that you have to look at. I want to talk about a couple of breaches just to raise a few points in particular. So one of them was from a couple of years ago was Capital One. They had a data breach. This was done actually by an insider at one of their vendors, really by somebody at AWS. But the issue here was that the reason she was able to get in, it appears, is because of misconfigurations or a lack of alert. In other words, it wasn't that the hole was in AWS's system per se. It was that Capital One didn't make a particular change that it could have to protect this. And again, there was obviously a bad actor who took advantage of this. But again, the threats can come from all sorts of different places. And it's not just the US, right? And I just wanted to pick a Canadian financial example as well. One of the challenges is that, and looking at the Desjardins example, one of the challenges is that very often, even when you find something suspicious, the amount of time it takes you to track it down, particularly if it's an insider, can be very challenging, and it can take many, many months to understand exactly what happened and then figure out how to address it. So how can we try to prevent some of these things? There is no way, as a practical matter, to stop everything. But there are a lot of little things that we can do, and each of these steps progressively reduces the risk. And the most basic one is understanding what you have and where everything is. One of the things that some of the newer laws, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, the GDPR in Europe, and some of the other laws in the US, one of the things they're now really requiring in order to comply is what we generally call a data map, knowing where things are. And one of the things that has happened regularly in my role doing this with clients is that we found data, and often significant data, that the client had no idea that they had. And they had no idea that this was sitting in a system. So really going through understanding where you have your data, which vendors have it, and then prioritizing among those vendors to say, okay, these guys have all of our information. They have all our KYC information, all our AML information. If these guys get hacked, we have a big problem. So let's understand what that is. So understanding that is one thing. Thinking through what your risks are, identifying key risks is a real important part of this. And that requires sitting down and thinking about it. There's no magic to doing it. Try to get into the bad guy's head. If I was the bad guy and know what I know about our systems and our data, what would I try to do? Where's the place I could cause the most damage? And then try to address those. It is not possible, as I started with, to address every risk. It really isn't. So really start a process of going through. And one of the things we always talk about in the cybersecurity world is maturity, is maturing a program. So it's not having a program. It's not being compliant. Nobody's ever going to be fully compliant, or as soon as you are, something new happens and you're not. But it's a matter of being a little bit better each day as you go through it. And again, establish what your priorities are so that you can tackle one thing at a time and progressively become better. So there was actually a question that just came up, which was, I think, a perfect timing for the question about what are some everyday things that can be done. And some really basic technical protections. One is having long and complicated passwords. That's actually even a better protection generally than the practice that I think a lot have of changing your password every 90 days. If you have something that's long and complicated and that you don't reuse it, again, you don't want a password, a credential stuffing scenario. If you have a long and complicated password, that is a relatively good protection. Again, the way these passwords are often cracked or often accessed is through something called a brute force attack, where basically the bad guys have a computer generate every possible password and just keep running numbers and keep trying it until something succeeds. And just to give you an indication of how length and complexity changes things, a 10 number only password would be cracked almost instantaneously by a brute force attack. It would take seconds or milliseconds to go through all the possible combinations to get through that. If you use an 8-character password that has uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols, again, to get through the totality of possibilities would take roughly 8 hours. But now let's go sort of to something longer. If you have 18 characters in your password and all 4 elements, again, so you have an 18-character password or passphrase, and I think that's one of the things that's useful to conceptualize. Don't think of it as a password. Think of it as a word or a collection of words or a collection of abbreviations that make sense to you, interspersed with some numbers and characters, and use some uppercase, lowercase. If you have all 4 of those factors in there, uppercase, lowercase, number, and symbol, and it's 18 characters long, it would take roughly, to go through all possible combinations, roughly, I think, 7 quadrillion years is sort of the number that's used. So it's much, much more difficult. So even just making a password 18 characters or 20 characters makes it very, very unlikely that somebody would be able to, through a brute force attack, get through. But the other thing, so these are all the things right now that I'm listing here are the basic things that you should always do. And the other one that is a regular fail, and if you look at the vast majority of business email compromises now, somewhere in that process, there was a failure to have multi-factor authentication. And what that means is that in order to access the account, you don't just need a password, you need some other, what we call factor, to do that. And very often that factor is using something like a Google Authenticator or an RSA Authenticator as a second factor. Sometimes it's through a phone number, through a text to a phone, which isn't quite as good. But the factors generally are what you know, something that you know, which would be a password, something that you have, in this case, it would be your phone that would let you do that and go through the password. Something that you are, which would be like a biometric identifier, right? And as long as you have more than one of those factors, that will help protect you, because it is unlikely that the bad guy will have both of those. One of the things that we see often, and that historically banks have always done, is actually really the same factor, which is they ask you for a password and your mother's maiden name. Well, those are both things that you know, and frankly, both things that are pretty easy to find out. A mother's maiden name is a pretty easy thing for a bad guy to find out. We then have encryption. Make sure your data is encrypted whenever you can. It can be annoying, but it's also a really useful protection. Don't log on to Wi-Fi where you don't know people, where you don't know the owner of the Wi-Fi. Hotel Wi-Fi, airport Wi-Fi, all of those things are really dangerous. If you're doing it, do it on a VPN. There are pretty good VPNs for both for mobile devices and for laptops. And then make sure as a company that you know where all your devices are, so that you have what's called MDM, mobile device management, so that you can, if somebody loses their phone, you can wipe the phone. You can press a button, it all gets deleted. What's really important in thinking about all of this, and this goes to some of the things that reduce liability, and I'm going to skip the access control, which is a little more technical, is look through your processes and procedures. Plan for all of these things. So have your IT team look through it, and it may be that you need to bring in outside experts. And it is not that the IT folks don't know what they're doing, they're bad. There's nothing to do with that. It's a matter of resources. And very often the IT team that is trying to keep your system running and that has to respond to help desk questions, all this, isn't going to be able to spend the time on security also. So it's really useful to have them think through all of that. And we all have to be trained. We all have to make sure that we think about it on a regular basis to make sure.
My apologies. I just had a comment in terms of your reflections on exactly what you said in terms of having certain experts that are experts in cybersecurity, doing SOC 2 assessments, having a penetration testing, things of that nature. Can you just touch on that a little bit? Because I think it's really, like you said, you really need outside experts, or if you're a larger institution, individuals that are very specialized to assist the whole enterprise with their, to have a sound program in place.
Thanks. No, I agreed. And I think that, and this is actually going to the point on the slide, which is, I think, perfect timing. There are a lot of things that can be done to try to understand where your vulnerabilities are. And having a third party do vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, having somebody say, this is where your holes are, right? There are a lot of films where, where we see, the companies hire bad guys to try to break into their vault and see what happens. And that's essentially what you want to do. You want to have a trusted pretend bad guy try to get in and see what they're able to find. And that's really going to help you do it. And using an outside vendor is much more effective than using somebody internal, no matter how good your internal people are. And I think, frankly, your internal people probably appreciate having somebody else say, by the way, these are things that we have to do. I mentioned vendor management earlier as one of the key issues that we have to focus on. Devices are a big vulnerability. So make sure that people are aware that if they lose their device, they're going to be blamed for not reporting it. It's bad that they lost it. If they don't report it, that's when they're really going to get into trouble. So make sure people immediately report if they lose a device. That's one of the most common vulnerabilities. And a few things to think about for phishing and business email compromises. Use email filters. There's a lot of software that can reduce the number that gets through. It doesn't solve it, but it can reduce what gets through. Be very careful what you click on, and train people to be careful what they click on, so that if you get something from somebody you trust, it has a URL in it that purports to be from Bank of America or whoever. I just picked an example. Go to the site that you know that's B of A. Don't pretend. Don't click through on the link in that email. Don't provide account information on a redirection link. If you click through on something, never log in through that. That's a very light, and sometimes it's legitimate, right? But you have to be very, very careful when you're doing it. As Cameron discussed earlier, when you get payment instructions, make sure you verify them with a live person. One of the interesting things that I've seen happen a number of times is that the bad guys are now actually calling immediately afterwards to verify. So they assume that the person they talk to won't recognize the voice. They pick up the phone and call immediately and say, by the way, I just sent you an email. I'm XYZ. I'm in a rush, but can you please just do it? And very often people, we try to be helpful. It sounds reasonable, right? We got the email, we got the phone call. It sounds right. We do it. The other thing that I've seen happen in a number of these cases, which again is a poor training issue, is that in order to verify the wire transfer instructions, the person goes to the email that has the wire transfer instruction, rather than looking up the phone number that they have in their CRM system, they actually look at the phone number at the bottom of the email and just call that number, which is not the correct number and is the bad guy's number. And one of the key alerts that you'll get is if somebody's really pushing you to do something very, very quickly that maybe really doesn't have to be done that quickly. That's often a sign that they are a bad actor, and again, trying to just make you do something that you wouldn't otherwise do. To address ransomware, one of the key things to do is maintain offline backups. But the other thing that's really important, and again, I mentioned at the beginning, that it's over 9 months very often from the time an incident starts till the time it's discovered and mitigated. Make sure you have long-term backups, because if you only have, let's say, 60 days worth of backups, normally that's going to be fine. The problem is if a bad guy has been in your system, the ransomware has been in your system for 90 days, you only have 60 days worth of backups. Guess what? All of that data is now corrupted, potentially. So make sure that you have backups that are long enough to save you from that. And before I jump into insurance, I think there was a question that I think is useful, which is, which industries are greatest risk? And the two industries that are greatest risk are financial services and healthcare. Healthcare has a few more attacks, and actually the attacks tend to be more expensive. Financial services is number 2 in that. And the other thing that's really important to think about is insurance. And Cameron, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we've seen obviously is the cyber insurance rates going up, which is consistent with more attacks in the industry, but just really understanding what your insurance policy covers, renewing your policy, and then having a sound program in place, as Doran indicated. But also just ensuring that you have, with a policy, you have individuals that you can lean on to provide you guidance. I think if you are a firm that is in the financial services industry, you should not be out there without having outside experts available to you. Even if you're not using them on a routine basis, you should have a relationship with them, because it may be a time that you will need them, and it will be very timely. So I think it's very important to have a program in place that includes understanding what you would do in case there is a breach, and how you react to it. Those are my thoughts, Nora.
No, thanks. And I think one of the things that is important to Cameron's point is make sure that your broker is experienced in cyber issues. Understanding the precise type of coverage, unlike some other policies that we have in place where the industry norms have developed to a point that they're really understandable in relative terms for an insurance policy, but you generally know what's going to be covered. Cyber liability policies have a lot of exclusions, a lot of carve-outs, a lot of conditions because it has not yet been standardized. So it's really important that your broker understand where your risk issues are so that you don't accidentally get subject to a limitation in your policy on exactly the issue that you need. And the other thing that's really, really important in this is planning. Planning reduces the cost of an incident. It's one of the things that was in the in that initial slide by about 50%. So if you have policies and procedures to deal with an incident, to deal with the risks, and you've tested it, you've actually run through and run a tabletop or a simulation, and maybe do those with some of your key vendors, or do it with, have somebody from your insurance company sit with you to do that. That makes a huge difference, because when you're actually in the middle of an incident, none of these things are going to, if you haven't worked through it, none of these things are going to make a lot of sense to you. So really planning is enormously helpful. A former colleague of mine who was an NYPD lieutenant used to describe sort of the NYPD had policies and procedures for absolutely everything. They were in their desk, and when a bad thing happened, they would pull out that policy, look at the first 3 things on it, and then toss it. But at least it gave them the first 3 steps. Instead of running around like a chicken with their head cut off, they knew the first 3 things that they had to do. And that's really, really useful. And very often what those first 3 things are: who do we call? Right? Who's our insurance broker? Do we have that person's number? What if the attack is a ransomware attack that shuts down everything, including access to your contact list? You won't even be able to figure out how to contact your insurance provider. So having a policy, I can tell you that for a lot of my clients, I have a printed copy of their policy that I keep in my drawer. So I know who they have to call. All they have to do is call me, and I've given them copies. You print this out, you keep it just in case. So once you've been hit, what are the things that you have to do? First thing you do is try to limit what happens, right? Try to isolate and secure the system and the data so that it doesn't keep expanding. Keep a copy of everything. This is going to be really important, both for litigation, to defend yourself against claims that will likely be made, but also to allow a forensic firm to see what happened and to try to make sure they've closed down the vulnerabilities. If you start deleting things, it may be that you'll never be able to figure out what happened. So it's important to think through that. Engaging breach counsel and engaging an IT forensics firm. One of the things that you may want to consider, and this is something that most of my clients do, is whether in the case of a breach, you want to actually have your lawyers engage the forensics teams to try to maintain privilege in the conversations. It is not unlikely that at some point in that communication, somebody is going to send an email saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe we screwed up, we did this." It's much better if that communication goes to the lawyer and you can at least potentially have a defense that was part of a privileged communication trying to create legal defenses than that just being out there and being discoverable and being Exhibit A against you when there are claims from your customers. And an outside firm is very useful. I can tell you from experience that even very sophisticated companies benefit significantly from having an external forensic vendor look through their systems and figure out what happened. Even when there are very, very sophisticated internal people. Working with law enforcement is a really important part of this and a really useful part. One of the things that's important to recognize, and I think Cameron can talk to this as well, the FBI is very clear that when you are reporting a breach, you are a victim, and that's how they're going to treat you. So they're not going to go looking for other things that you may have done wrong and say, "Oh, well, you're a bad actor." They are really treating you as a victim of this crime. and will look to deal with you in that way. So communicating with them can be very helpful. It also looks much better to your clients and to your customers that you've reached out and you're working with law enforcement. Thinking about your crisis communications and PR, if you think about some of the bigger breaches that have happened over the last number of years, one of the big failures that a lot of these companies have had is they have gotten out in front of the facts and reported things, made mistakes in their reporting, made mistakes in, they initially say, oh, it was only 50 people, and then it became 100 people, and then it became 10,000 people. Trying to control your communication, and an experienced PR firm will help you with this, is understand when you should be jumping out in front of the communication and when you should say, let's wait until we have a little bit more information so that we know.
Hey, Doran, just on the topic of alerting the FBI and then the regulators, just, in terms of how a regulator may react differently than the FBI, because they do have mandates, and I know Doran's worked in many responses with regulators, and he's very sensitive to this, but some of these regulators are very aggressive. The various states in the Northeast have brought very, very high dollar fines against firms, and they're releasing PII data for residents of their jurisdiction when they didn't have good processes or procedures in place. So it's just important for firms to be aware of that, and as practitioners in the financial service industry, I think just be aware that the regulators will not just look at what happened; they're going to look to see what you had in place and how you responded.
Yeah, and sort of the last 5 minutes that I have is really just talking about that regulatory response piece, and how, again, while law enforcement is treating you as a victim, your regulator might look for the flaws, and one of the advantages there of having counsel involved early is the ability to try to control some of that messaging. So I'm actually now just going to jump, and I'll skip the particular rules and regulations. So, I've included a number of the key rules and regulations here in terms of what needs to be considered. But let me talk a little bit more specifically about some of the cases. And I'm just looking at, we're running a little bit long. So let me actually talk about a few in particular. And again, this is, this is to Cameron's point about what regulators look at. About 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years ago, Voya had to pay a fine in an SEC investigation because its processes failed. The company did not have appropriate procedures. It did not have appropriate training in place, and there ended up being a significant violation. And again, the fine here was not small in terms of what the SEC went for. There are other cases where the issuers were not fined by or the investment advisors were not fined by the SEC because these were things that at the time, were things that they could have done better, but weren't really known. I think if these things happen today, as Cameron mentioned, and I'll talk about a little bit later, if these types of things happen today, I think the SEC is much less likely to be as forgiving in doing it. So I know Cameron didn't name the companies in the recent SEC enforcement actions. I am. The SEC brought 3 enforcement actions and fined 3 companies. All of these were business email compromises, and all of these were things that, if you look at the facts, were things that probably should have been discovered much earlier and shut down much earlier and notified much earlier. So there were a series of failures here in each of these cases that make these sort of good examples for enforcement. They don't make it clear exactly where those lines would be from bad actors, for regulators in less obvious cases. but it's really important to think through, make sure that you secure your email. Again, this goes back to requiring complex passwords and enforcing complex passwords. And then using multi-factor authentication. If there's one thing that you take away from this, if you do not have multi-factor authentication on all of your systems that are internet facing, do that right away. That's a really, really key thing that will reduce a significant number of your vulnerabilities. And then lastly, I just want to raise one thing from FINRA, again, from about 3 years ago. It is important that when systems are attacked, that you actually report, even if the attacks aren't successful. FINRA does expect suspicious activity reports, SARS, to be filed. So it's really important to think through all of this. And when something happens, consult with your advisors on with your legal advisors on what you have to do, because you are exposing yourself to potential claims and potential regulatory actions, because the regulators are not friendly to failures to provide notice to them or to other parties. And the last piece that I just wanted to talk about very quickly before we run out of time is an example here, again, from about 3 years ago, that ultimately you are responsible for your IT vendors. Even if you don't have the knowledge internally, it is really important that you understand what your vendors are doing, that sometimes you may have to engage a third party to do due diligence on your vendors to make sure that they have appropriate controls in place. And then once you have done that, once you've required that they have those, make sure that they actually do it. And in this case, the issue was that there was a requirement to do it, and it turns out that the IT vendor never did what they were supposed to do. So it's really important to make sure that you have those procedures in place with your vendors to make sure that the controls are in place and that they're actually enforced to try to reduce your liability. And Cameron, I don't know if you have anything to add. Just at the end of this, I do have a number of additional citations just for you to look at. And in fact, also some resources to go to. I will make this PowerPoint available. If anybody wants it, contact the CFA Society and they can get you a copy of this. With respect to a hybrid work model, this is a question that just came up that I'll try to answer very quickly. The important things to think about are some of the things that we addressed earlier in the presentation in terms of making sure that you understand what people have on their personal devices, controlling those personal devices, making sure that they actually have multi-factor authentication, trying to get into for an email. A lot of us just use webmail and all you have is a password because it is really annoying to have to do that second factor all the time. It is annoying, and one of my clients, it's actually a public company, their C-suite people really dislike the idea of having to do multi-factor authentication. So of all the people, the highest risk people are the ones who really don't want to do it. That's changed. But the fight was from the senior people who really didn't want to do multi-factor authentication. That's, again, your biggest defense. If you do not have multi-factor authentication, do that. The challenges of working remotely is that we're all doing things on systems that are not controlled by the company. So we're all losing some of that control. Trying to sandbox that, in other words, trying to limit the scope of what is done on personal computers as much as possible is a really important protection. So, for example, I can tell you that my firm, I can log on from my personal computer using Citrix, but it's through a separate Citrix window. And I can't, it's very difficult to cut and paste things. It's really a separate system. So I have that separate VPN tunnel with a separate Citrix instance that is the way I am using, I'm logging into my system. So essentially, even though it's physically on my MacBook, it's really a separate system within that. In answer, there was a question here about whether there's some industry standard cybersecurity checklists. There are a number of them out there. I can try, if you provide the CFA Society with your contact information, I'll send you some links and some ideas of some cybersecurity checklists.
Yes, and everyone, you can reach out to me and Doran directly as well, and we can get that information to you.
So here's my information if you want it, and I can certainly, if you want to reach out to me, I can send you some links to some common information if that's helpful.
Yeah, and just to add to that, FINRA has a checklist as well, and most of the larger firms have their own kind of unique checklist they send to third parties, which we've seen many of in terms of their due diligence, SOC 2 reviews, and things of that nature. But with that, Doran, thank you so much. A lot of great information, timely information, really alerting us of how we can protect our businesses, our franchises, and our clients, and how we can navigate this continuing threat that continues to evolve in our industry. But we really appreciate your time and sharing your intelligence with us.
Great. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.